It's really my great pleasure and honor to be able to offer just a few remarks in response to these opening lectures by Andrew Woolford and Philip Spencer, who have each been so thoughtful and thought-provoking in their papers to introduce this symposium topic on comparison and convergence. As a human rights scholar, I am grateful to have this chance to benefit from the broad survey that was contained in both of their papers on the state of the field of genocide studies. These lectures, along with Timothy Snyder's excellent keynote, were really filled with creative energy as they wove for us new information into older narratives in a respectful yet urgent way. Because the need for genocide studies remains urgent. And I'm really pleased to see the impressive body of work that is being carried on, especially by a new generation of interdisciplinary scholars, including some we claim as our own. So what first point that I carry away from these two papers is that despite their differences in style, I would suggest that both Philip and Andrew share a similar negotiated middle ground on the need for flexible boundaries in determining what is or isn't genocide, what Andrew Woolford describes as an exercise in boundary making. Likewise, Woolford and Spencer, like Snyder last night, reject the rigid fencing off of the possibility of comparisons between the Holocaust and other genocides. They refuse to engage in the prickish academic behavior so vividly described by Andrew Woolford. These scholars see the value in learning from the study and analysis of various situations of genocide and mass atrocities, even ones that are far removed from the Holocaust and from the Genocide Convention in space and time. Spencer notes the pendulum shift that has occurred in the past decades, so that in his words, rather than genocide studies needing the help of Holocaust studies, the reverse is the case, as studies of the Holocaust can now benefit from insights made by genocide scholars. Clearly, the most evident difference in these two approaches is the positionality of the research done by Woolford and Spencer, with Woolford's examination of the question being influenced by reactions to his own research on the peripheral settler colonial genocides, sort of looking from the outward in with regard to definitional boundaries, while Spencer takes as his vantage point the traditional genocide studies that emanated from his scholarship on the Holocaust and the Convention, looking from the inside out at critics and new waves of scholarship on these issues. These starting points clearly influence their analysis, and both of them give us a vivid sense of the risks that lie at the extremes of either position. At one end, there is the circling of the definitional wagons that refuses even to consider the contributions of new scholarship, rendering entire groups of people, women, migrants, indigenous communities, as examples, as invisible. Woolford notes that, ironically, this narrow approach engages in its own practices of othering, placing certain notions or interpretations beyond the realm of the reasonable. He argues instead for a concept of genocide studies as a fluid category of evolving singularities, a set which he acknowledges about which we have only partial knowledge and can have only partial knowledge. Spencer, on the other hand, reminds us of the risks inherent in expansion and revision of the category of genocide, ruminating on the political consequences of decentering the Holocaust. He gives due attention to the rise of the anti-imperialist school of genocide scholarship, this alternative approach in which the Holocaust is no longer the necessary starting point or the central or paradigmatic case. While recognizing the significant scholarly contributions of this group, Spencer warns of the way in which its arguments do not merely situate the Holocaust in a different framework, but work to minimize its significance. So considering these framings and risks reminded me of similar debates and struggles within the related field of human rights in which I work. There was, of course, the full-throated debate in the 1990s that continues until today about whether NGOs, and particularly Western-based NGOs, should expand their mandates to advocate for economic, social, and cultural rights, in addition to civil and political rights. Thanks to many of the same anti-imperialist arguments, Western advocates came to realize that economic and social rights were not really second generation, but co-equal to civil and political rights. So dying from starvation or lack of access to clean water or health care was just, left you just as dead as being killed by the police. Intense battles within organizations and the public criticism that followed centered around this argument of dilution that seems to also resonate in genocide scholarship. Dilution of the efficacy, the how do we measure our success, how do we frame violations in a way that allows us to succeed. So inevitably, of course, advocacy for economic and social rights found its way into the canon, not really at the expense of civil and political rights. But a couple of the questions that arose from that debate also seem relevant here. One is, who gets to decide? Is it we the scholars, we the human rights advocates, or are the voices of the victims central to the discussion? And who are the gatekeepers in that discussion? In this regard, I have some sympathy for Andrew and his role with the International Association of Genocide Scholars, where he is often in the position of being the arbiter of human suffering, or the arbiter of whose voices count and whose don't. It's problematic for advocates as well as scholars. Another challenge shared by genocide and human rights scholars is temporality. What are the limits of applying new categories of violations to historical occurrences? There's always a temptation on our part to analyze past violence through modern legal or conceptual categories. After all, these antecedents have often provided the historical roots that drove advocacy for international norm-making in the first place. Think about the slave trade and various forms of religious persecution, or the connection of technological developments of weaponry and war crimes. But how far should this analysis go? It is not a stretch for us to include the Armenian genocide, which occurred in the 19th century and in the European context, but how far back? The reparations discussions that take place in the African American community regarding slavery and the slave trade will push us to consider this. When can we impose limits on the backward-looking application of criminal categories? So 2 further points, and I promise I'll turn it over to y'all. First is this category that Philip strongly asserts, which is reminding us about genocide as the crime of crimes. And I believe that this crime of crimes hierarchy is really unfortunate, and that it reinforces some comparisons that are problematic. I always tell the story. I was a guest at a dinner party that friends who shall remain nameless, where it went long into the night, a battle about which was worse, the Holocaust or the Argentine Dirty War, by 2 close friends who were affected by each of those. And it's a level of pain and absurdity, of course, that we have to have that kind of debate. But by framing genocide as the crime, advocates and scholars insist on trying to fit their documentation into that box. And I think it's critical to seek out knowledge about why and how all atrocities are carried out so we can prevent them. So this really redounds to the invisibility question, the invisibility of certain victims. So Philip read this very convincing list of genocide since the Holocaust, but what about the victims who were not on that list? The victims from Cambodia who were not Chan or Muslim, the victims in Chile who were political dissidents, not different ethnic groups or national or racial groups. We're struggling with this on El Salvador. Were the indigenous groups killed because they were indigenous or because they were perceived as political opponents? In Guatemala, you threw in leftists in your list, but leftists are not victims of genocide. They don't fit the genocide definition. Even in the conflicts that we see today that we think of as genocidal, in Syria, who qualifies as genocidal victims? Only the Kurds? What about, what about ethnic groups that are the same religion as the people who are killing them? And we can go on. In Darfur, we saw this painfully with the International Commission on Darfur, where legal scholars did very careful analysis in determining that tribal differences were enough, and then backed away at the last minute to determine that, well, the intent, there was not enough evidence of intent. So I'm not sure that fits in my invisible category, but these people are dead in massive numbers. They're not victims of the crime of crimes, but they're victims of mass atrocities. So I think about the model of our graduate seminar that Alejandro and I chair on the Holocaust, Genocide, and Mass Violence, which leaves aside the need to categorize, momentarily at least, in the service of the pursuit of scholarship on the prevention of atrocity of crimes of all sorts, atrocity crimes. So my final point, and this this may show the limits of my knowledge as a genocide scholar, but it's really about this legal definition. It looms large in this categorization problem because of the narrowness of the categories and the strictness of the intent requirements. Non-legal scholars, like many here, create their own definitions, but the dominance of the legal definition and its active use in current international tribunals means that we are forced to engage with it, as both of you have in your papers. I have my personal experience with Eric Weitz and Stephen Feinstein, who called me to a meeting one day more than a decade ago, where they wanted to include me as a lawyer in the discussion of the definition of genocide, and I said, what discussion? The definition is Article 2, right? That was where I started my knowledge of definitions, and fortunately have come a long way in realizing the need for a different kind of disciplinary definitions. But ironically, I wanted to point out, or maybe not ironically, that there is a great deal of flexibility within Article 2 itself. There's obviously the in whole or in part element that Phillips talked about and wrote about. But additionally, the actus reus sections offer much broader legal boxes in which to identify and prosecute crimes as genocide. So we go beyond all the prohibited actions, or we go beyond the prohibited actions in subsection A on killings, and we have ample room for interpretation of many situations as genocide that don't really get discussed in the scholarship very much. So beyond subsection A, killings of the group, we have causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. I don't really need to read this to this crowd, but you get the idea, the imposing measures intended to prevent births. I don't, there's there are these huge areas of the definition that allow for interpretation of genocide, as long as they, of course, meet that initial threshold of groups and intent. So I'm quite certain I'm showing the limits of my knowledge in genocide studies and pointing out this obvious point, but what I just want to say is the intent to destroy, which is codified in the convention, attaches to many different kinds of actions that do not require such a high threshold. So I just wanted to conclude by thinking about what lawyers and scholars have to learn from each other on these questions. And in my work in advocacy, I've seen lawyers as untethered advocates in using as many arguments as they can in zealous representation of their clients, right? So lawyers don't really care about past precedents or theories or concepts. They're all about advocating to the ultimate conclusion of their client's case. And so maybe we can learn from lawyers the positive things about advocating zealously for victims, putting victims at the center, but not just to compete, not just to try to attain the recognition of the crime of crimes. That isn't the kind of zealous advocacy I think is important. And what lawyers and advocates can learn from scholars is to supersede the reductive model, to make visible the invisible. That's something scholars and advocates can do. To look closely at groups that have been erased from history and will never have a day in court because they don't meet the definition or they don't exist and there are no voices there to tell their story. And finally, really thinking about what we both do in common is we keep in mind that our work is contributing to a larger end, which is the prevention of these atrocities. And that is really what sets apart this scholarship from any other scholarship that we see often in our academic world. So thank you both for your interventions. And if you want to come forward, I don't know if you want to at this point, Andrew, or we'll just take some questions.
Get a picture?
Yeah, we'll get him up. Andrew needs a picture, so we'll make him stand up. So I promise. So let's go. These three. We'll start with Eric, Wolf, and Paula.
I mean, like Barb, I found both presentations and papers very, very good at laying out the landscape of genocide studies and critical issues. I want to pick up on a few things and maybe put especially. Cool, though I've also, got some reservations and keep my distance. I think there are two critical contributions that Dirk Moses and Donald Bloxham, Sima, and others have made. One you mentioned, and one I think you did not, or if you did it very briefly. The one that you did not is pushing the perpetrator camp, if you will, beyond the well-known dictatorial states of the 20th century to liberal states, and to bring them into vision as those who have also been perpetrators of genocide and various crimes against humanity. I think that's very, very important. The other thing they have done is expand the chronological framework, and this connects with comments Andrew made in his presentation, with which I agree very much. And you, Philip, quoted Patrick Wolf, who says, settler colonialism was not an event, but a structure, and a structure with an eliminationist impulse that continued over decades and sometimes over centuries. And I think that's a very powerful and important insight, which leads to a critique that I would make of genocide studies as a field that it has been so focused on the event of genocide rather than antecedents, as Andrew talked about, or a long-term process of elimination. And I'll talk about this a little bit afterward. The other side of it is that there's been almost no discussion about the aftermaths of genocide except in the field of memory. But in fact, genocides are political and economic events that go beyond the mass destruction of people. I'm not convinced, Philip, that one can talk about, in general, a learning process among perpetrators of genocide and other crimes against humanity. I'm not sure there needs to be a learning process. I think that's an empirical question that one then has to investigate historically. But the long list you've got there, and it is, of course, a terrible list. I'm just not convinced they learn one from the other. And if, as you said so poignantly, the Holocaust was the event that lit up the sky, and I think that's absolutely right, I'm not sure you've solved the conundrum of how we then understand the Holocaust in conjunction with the various events that the anti-imperialist school point to. In other words, I think you leveled a very effective critique about their critique of the centrality of the Holocaust, but I'm still not sure how, from your point of view, how we would understand these together.
So I'm planning to take 4 comments and then throw it back to you. So take notes.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to address Philip's arguments, or better to say 2 of them, which I'm a little bit uncomfortable with. One is the argument that the Holocaust uniqueness argument is not there anymore. I think it still is. It may have faded in a way, but it's also important in what circles you are moving here around. So I would think it's not very strong in the genocide field, but still among Holocaust scholars you find this, and at least maybe not so open again like it was, but it is still there. And then even fueled more by kind of recent anti-Semitism in Europe, which kind of brings this back again a little bit. So there's I see rather a revival there. And I think it contributes a little bit to the divide I have to obviously see between Holocaust and genocide studies, which is still there. So, for example, I organized Lessons and Legacies in fall 2016. I expected much more, let's say, contributions about genocides, and there were no applications, which I found stunning. Yeah, which is different when we think about the IAGS, which gets applications from Holocaust scholars, but I also think not as many as one would suspect. So there is a divide. The second thing, briefly, when you claimed that there is this kind of eliminationist, radical thinking about the Holocaust, I would say question is in two levels. One, as a Holocaust scholar, the Nazis made a lot of exceptions. Forced labor was one of them. Many survivors survived because of these exceptions. So there is a little bit kind of the totalitarian aspect of it is questionable. Second of all, if you think about genocide as a field, the attacks on Native Americans, Tasmania come to mind. There are many cases where I think you have a similar eliminationist attack on a group. So I think this kind of singularity of this approach is kind of, for me, questionable as well as the totalitariety.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. Basically, well, the first one is, like, why do we insist to call something a genocide and not something else as a crime against humanity?
Murder.
Like other international crime, basically. But genocide instead, something that has not like a high threshold to prove. And the other one, like looking up to the future, I was thinking about the flexible interpretation of the genocide definition, and I was thinking that so far, like international tribunals have applied a dolus especialis in the case of intent. But the International Criminal Court, I think that in the case of intent in the Rome Statute, has established that a person has intent when it, in relation to a consequence, is aware that it will occur in the ordinary course of events. So it's thinking like in the case of a knowledge-based approach. So do you think that in the future it will move into a lower threshold and it will apply a knowledge-based approach in exchange of a dolus especialis, that it makes it difficult to apply or to prove a case of genocide?
And he's the
Okay, thanks. So I wanted to say that although I learned a lot from both of these presentations, my comfort level with not using genocide as a term of analysis remains very high. I quite agree with Wolf-Buna that the notion that the Holocaust is unique is very prevalent, especially in the parts of the world where the Holocaust actually took place, which is one of the reasons why just using the word genocide is very difficult, because it simply does mean something like the Holocaust, both for people who are on the attack, as it were, trying to claim the Holocaust legacy for themselves, and for people who are on the defensive, claiming therefore that the Holocaust is unique. And that's a dialectic which is very hard to get out from under. But listening to both presentations, I was also affirmed a different concern, which I think Barbara also went at from a different angle, namely that, as Andrews quite rightly says, there are these difficult to disclose events, which we would like to call genocide, but there are also events of massive killing, which we can't really call genocide. So the famine of the Great Leap Forward kills more people than every other event we're going to mention in this conference taken together, and yet few people would refer to it as a genocide. Similarly, the causes, and this was implicit, I think, Andrew, in one of your answers to a question, the causes of these different kinds of extermination may be different. So the cultural assimilation, which I'm happy to accept as genocide legally, the cultural assimilation requires a certain level of state development, which mass killing, ironically, may not require. Mass killing is sometimes a result of an absence of certain kinds of state capacity, or a certain conjuncture where the state itself is under question, which actually was the point you made in response to questions, that at one point you can kill, at another point you can't kill. I would put that a slightly different way, having to do with what kind of state capacity is up for grabs. Likewise, I mean, there are moral concerns which are different, and which I saw animating, you can correct me in both of your presentations. It is one kind of moral concern to worry about the end of a culture. It's another kind of moral concern to worry about the murder of human beings. One should probably have both of them, but when, for example, Germany invades Poland and the task of the Einsatz movement is to kill the leading layers of Polish society, that is wrong because it's genocidal in the sense of wanting to eliminate a culture, but it's also wrong in the sense that it's depriving hundreds of thousands of families of the father of the family, right? Those are two different kinds of wrongs which animate us in different ways, and I'm not sure that genocide grasps them all. Finally, Philip, if you'll permit me to borrow Andrew's concept of the hospitable, I'm going to call it the dialectic of hospitality. It seems to me that the two schools that you cite, I mean, if you like, the intentionalists, the people who focus on the ideology and on Germany, and the colonialists, the people who focus on Southern colonialism. One can say that they're both wrong, or one can say that they're both right. I think they're only right together. That is to say, if you focus on Germany on ideology, you're utterly helpless to explain why there was no Holocaust in Germany, why there was no Holocaust in the 1930s. There couldn't have been. But if you focus only on frontier colonialism and the war in the East, you're utterly helpless to explain why the Jews were treated, in fact, differently and worse than the targets of the frontier colonialism, which were the Ukrainians, the Russians, the Poles, and the Belarusians. So, as I see it, I mean, those two schools of thought do not work separately, either of them at all, to explain the Holocaust, but do work together. And so if one takes the open attitude, which both of you in different ways were urging, I think one ends up with a better explanation of the Holocaust.
grant you each 3 minutes.
Okay, gosh. Well, yeah. Right, I'll just very quickly, okay. Just briefly, Bob, on the question of the list, I actually was very, perhaps I didn't make this clear enough. That's a very limited list. Okay, I would go on and on and on. In my book on genocide since 45, I use a list compiled by Barbara Hoff some time ago. But as I said in my paper, one could keep adding to it. On the group question, look, partly what I'm exploring here is the boundary between scholarship and citizenship in our work and what we're doing here, and thinking a little bit about what we're trying to do and how we can help. Okay, part of my fear about too open a view about it, too flexibility about it, is we need to respond to things that are happening right now. That's my anxiety. Okay, so intellectually, I'm completely convinced by David Messesian's book on political groups. I think all of the arguments that apply to the groups identified in the convention apply to political groups. I think it's an open and shut case myself, right? And I think the courts are moving in that direction. When they discussed the Rwandan genocide, for example, at the tribunal, they said the perpetrators here claimed that they were dealing with a political problem. Right? They used it as a kind of get-out. They used the convention. This is partly the kind of learning bit here. They used the convention as a way of denying what they were doing. And of course, that just doesn't make any sense here. Right? So I think one can think about how the perpetrators define groups that they want to kill. And I think the convention opens up to it. I want to come back to the idea that let's not make the best the enemy of the good. I do think your notion of lawyers as untethered advocates, you won't like this either, right, is very helpful to me. And I think what our scholarship can do is give lawyers ammunition and give people recognition. Okay, so that's one set of responses. I'm going on for too long. So very quickly, okay. Yes, liberal states. They certainly did help us think about liberal states, right? But the interesting thing is about time here. Well, it's a big question here. Do liberal democratic states, since the convention, commit genocide? Who is committing genocide right now? Okay, that's a big question for me. And how does one respond to it? So, for example, in the case of Rwanda, a highly influential book on Rwanda was by Mahmoud Mamdani, who says that really the problem here isn't the Hutu power nationalists, it's the Belgians and the French and the Germans. Well, actually, no. Right? Actually, the problem is the Hutu power nationalists. So simply wrong. Okay, in terms of responding now. So yes, but it seems to me, I talk about it in the paper and elsewhere, the convention's a rebuke. Right? The convention says you guys committed genocide. Right? And you have to take responsibility for what you did, and I'm completely with you on all of that stuff, right? But we also have to respond to genocides that are being committed and who they're being committed by right now. So that's the first point. Second point is, on the question of aftermath, I completely agree with you. I've written a long paper about denial, because the genocidal process is a long process, in my view, okay? And it includes the aftermath. And part of the recognition of what is done to people is an attempt to address that question in terms of what the role of denial is in the genocidal process, in my view. I didn't talk about it in my paper, but denial goes right the way through. Perpetrators of genocide deny they're planning to commit genocide when they are. They deny they're committing genocide when they are doing it, and they deny they've done it when they've done it. Part of our work has to be to uncover that denial, so I completely agree. And the third question, right, which is about how perpetrators learn. Yes, and there is a lot of empirical work to do. I've begun to do it. Actually, I've learned on you a bit in terms of thinking about the relationship between the Herero and the Armenian and the Nazi genocides, and what people were learning they could do. And I'm not just talking about Hitler's quote. I'm talking about processes, agency, and denial. And one of the interesting things to me about current genocides is what people are looking at in terms of hiding the trail because of the convention. So there's a learning process going on there too. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that explains everything, but it's an important dimension that we haven't really looked at by thinking about genocides over a long period of time. On the question of uniqueness, well, I mean, we're partly talking about experience here. It may be that, where you work and where I work, I don't seem to come across that problem. I come across the opposite problem. Now, somebody mentioned anti-Semitism in Europe, not just in Europe, by the way, and I've recently written a book about it, and if you have any trouble sleeping, I recommend it. The question here, which I didn't have time to talk about, and I'm very happy to talk about it in the discussion, is the relationship between the particular and the universal. It seems to me, and it's a bit about trying to include both. I think if you think about genocide only as a universal phenomenon, right, you abstract from it, it's the universal character of it, then you miss something. But if you only see the particular, you miss the other thing. And it seems to me that part of what is going on in anti-Semitism at the moment is an attack on the particularity of the Jewish experience and the Holocaust in favour of universalism, which has elements to me of denial, frankly. But we can talk about that somewhere else. Fifthly, okay, on intent. Well, we had an interesting discussion about it before. I agree with you that this notion of foreseeability is a very, very valuable and important thing. And it comes, that's where the scholarship helps. We're thinking about intent in much richer and more complex ways, and that can inform our untethered advocates, to quote you. Okay, lastly, yes, absolutely, ideology and structure, intent, agency, and so forth. Both. That's what I'm arguing for. I'm just trying to correct the balance. The point of critique here was to see what might be getting lost if you go down that route. And I am very preoccupied by ideology, for sure, because I see it as mobilizing people at lots of different levels in genocide. And I'm very preoccupied by intent, and I'm very preoccupied by agency. And the convention makes me think about it. And I want to come back to it. I'm not defending the convention as the last word on genocide. But it's there. Let's use it. Okay? There are lots of good arguments about the crime of crimes, crimes against humanity, and so forth. But why abandon this when we can use it? That's my point.
Okay, well, I already had my chance to answer some questions, so I will be very brief here, I think. I hope. I thank you, Barbara, for your summary, and I do like this idea of making visible the invisible, because I do think we can open up law through these sorts of conversations and have this role extending or challenging its terms. But there are some challenges with law. A lot of biases are built into our way of thinking about the law, and we can't simply tell a story of progress about the law that we move somehow from a period of no respect for human rights to things gradually getting better. There's going to be peaks and valleys here. We think of, for example, yes, sexual violence has been recognized as a form of genocide, but as Catherine McKinnon points out, in the Akiyesu definition, they finally get rid of this notion of consent being part, or something that should even be considered in sexual cases, sexual violence cases, cases of rape. How could you possibly have consent in a context of such mass violence? But later cases of the ICTY come back to thinking about consent and including consent as part of the consideration. So it's not necessarily a linear progress. There continues to need to be critical challenges of things like masculine domination as it's reflected within the law, aspects of colonial assumptions about as I say, the worthiness of some groups to be able to claim the right to be included under the law. And things like, even we have in the convention this notion that the transfer of children from one group to another is part of the Actus Reus, the United Nations Genocide Convention. But unfortunately, the understanding of this that's put forward in the Travel Preparatoire is that this would be a biological or physical form of destruction rather than a cultural technique of destruction, that the children will never return to their families. So the Canadian government, which actually didn't adopt that portion of the convention into Canadian law, so it doesn't even, they only took Article 2A and 2B into Canadian law, into domestic law. But when asked about that, the Canadian government will say, well, the children were eventually returned to their communities. So even though they were able to reintegrate or feel at home within that community, or there was a great deal of cultural and language loss that occurred through these schools, the law, blocks them from even using this claim that Lumpkin saw as a continuation of cultural genocide that survived the excising of the Article 3 on cultural genocide. So it's a difficult and challenging process that we need to be alert to. Question of the state came up, and I take Tim's point, and I also want to work in a response to Eric's question, even though it wasn't directed to me. But one thing in genocide studies I alluded to earlier, but we tend to think of the state in very, that there's little democratic states or authoritarian states, but states are not always necessarily so unified. Within a liberal democratic state, you will have, in the Gambian language, the exceptions, the moments of exception. But we can see something like that in the Canadian Indian Act. Like, how do you understand an act that controls every aspect of an Indigenous person's life, from what they can sell on reserve land to whether or not they can gamble, drink alcohol? Is that part of a liberal democratic order, or is that authoritarian? I think Jens Meyer-Henrich's work on South Africa is interesting here. So he believes, I don't know if it's Frankel, he draws on a German scholar, the notion of the dual state, and how states can be dualistic in this way. So something that we can consider. But yeah, I do take the point that there's changes in state developments are in the negotiation that is the state amongst the different state bodies. Sometimes, in this case, I'm talking about the financial department having huge influence over the Department of Interior over whether or not they should keep trying to kill Indians or they should educate them. So these internal differences within the state lead to changes or a change in focus, in the focus. And in terms of why I insist on calling something a genocide is because I think going back to Lemkin's initial impulse that our global diversity benefits from the existence of group. As a sociologist, I want to understand, well, what are groups? How do we protect something that is itself a fluid, developing, changing entity? But I think that protecting groups is important. But to protect groups, I think we can't just focus on mass killing. We have to think about all the ways that groups are potentially put at threat, and that requires a more capacious notion of genocide than law necessarily allows at this point, maybe.
Thank you both for really an excellent